The silver knife slipped from my hand and clattered against my dinner plate. The sound cut through the dining room like a blade. Everyone stopped laughing, everyone except my mother. "Oh, honey," Diana Wells said, her voice honeyed poison, her smile sharp enough to slice glass. "Don't look so shocked. You've always known you weren't really one of us." The room went silent. My stepfather, Mark, stared at his wine. My half-brother, Liam, smirked. But there was something uncertain in his eyes, something that suggested he was seeing his mother clearly for the first time. I sat frozen, my heart a trapped bird against my ribs. "What are you talking about?" My voice barely survived the lump in my throat. Diana raised her wine glass, catching the chandelier light. "You really thought your father wanted you? Edward pitted you, Aubrey. You were never meant to be part of this family. You were a burden we carried." Heat flooded my chest, burning behind my eyes. Everyone was watching. I felt their pity, their judgment, their relief that they weren't the target of Diana's cruelty. Not tonight. "Let's toast," Diana continued, her eyes glittering with something I'd never seen before. Not anger, satisfaction. To real family, the ones who truly belong. The glasses clinked like nails on a coffin. I gripped the edge of the table, fighting to stay composed. Liam chuckled softly, that nervous laugh he used when he was uncomfortable, and Diana's eyes flashed at him in a way that made him quiet immediately. "Don't be dramatic, Aubrey," my mother said, tilting her head with false concern. "We're just being honest. Isn't that what families do?" I stood up slowly, my hands shaking. The room held its breath. "I understand," I said softly, each word precise. "You've made your point." I picked up my coat, walked out the door, and heard Liam's voice behind me. "She can't even handle the truth." The November wind stung my face as I sat in my car. But I didn't cry. Not then. Something much colder had taken root inside me. Clarity. My name is Aubrey Wells. I'm 32 years old, a photographer with a modest talent and a modest life. Until that Thanksgiving, I believed love could fix anything. I was naive. When my father died of a heart attack when I was 14, my mother remarried within 18 months. Mark Henderson was wealthy, obscenely so, and came with a son. Liam was 16, golden-haired, confident, and instantly adored by everyone, including my mother. I became the shadow, the extra. Birthdays forgotten. College fund accidentally spent on Liam's business venture. Every photograph on the walls was of them. Diana and Mark's wedding, Liam's graduation, Liam's promotion. My photos were in a box in the basement, organized by a mother who'd lost interest. But I tried. Every single day, I tried to earn her love. When I graduated from college with honors in photography, she didn't attend the ceremony. When Liam scraped through community college 3 years later, she threw him a party at the country club. When I landed a gallery showing of my work, my first real success, she didn't call. I told myself she didn't know how to show affection. I told myself families were complicated. I told myself I was the problem, too sensitive, too needy, too much like my father. But that night, mascara running down my face in my apartment, I realized the terrible truth. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every slight was intentional. Every exclusion was calculated. The knife she'd driven into my heart had been sharpened by years of practice. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, her words replaying. "You were never meant to be part of this family. You were a burden we carried." And then I remembered something I'd forgotten I even knew, my father's study. His files, the things he kept locked away. The next morning, I drove to the house I'd grown up in. Mark had given me a key after my father's death, a guilt offering from a stepfather who'd never quite known what to do with a stepdaughter. The house smelled like Diana's rose perfume and expensive furniture polish. I found my way to Dad's old study, untouched since his death. Mark had converted his own office in the West Wing years ago, leaving this room as a kind of shrine no one visited. My hands trembled as I opened the filing cabinets. Tax records, insurance documents, the mundane architecture of a life. But then, behind one drawer, I found something that shouldn't have been there. A pale blue envelope with my name written in my father's familiar handwriting. Edward Wells. For Aubrey. To be opened only when necessary. My breath caught. I opened it slowly. My dearest Aubrey, if you're reading this, it means the truth can't stay buried forever. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for leaving you in a house where you'll never quite belong. I'm sorry for the man I wasn't strong enough to become. But listen to me carefully. Don't trust what you see on the surface. Diana has spent our entire marriage building an illusion. I loved you from the moment you were born, and I will love you from whatever comes next. That love is real. Everything else in this house is performance. Be careful who you trust, and when the time comes, look for my letters. There will be more than one. Your father, Edward. The letter was undated and signed except for the closing. But the handwriting was unmistakably his, the same careful penmanship that had written my name on every birthday card before he died. I read it 3 times, trying to understand what he meant. Don't trust what you see on the surface. Look for my letters. That's when I knew. My father had been leaving me a map, and I had finally decided to follow it. Over the following week, I visited the law office where my father had handled his estate. The receptionist, a woman named Miriam with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, recognized my name immediately. Your father was a good man, she said quietly, sliding a folder across the desk. He told me once, if you ever came asking questions, I should give you everything. He was very specific about that. Inside the folder were pages that changed everything. Edward's handwritten notes, fragments of his thoughts about Diana's late-night phone calls, her sudden charity meetings that happened 5 nights a week, her new jewelry that appeared without explanation, and then a separate document, a paternity report, dated 3 months before his death. The results were clear. The child listed as Liam Edward Henderson was not biologically related to Edward Wells. My father had known. He'd always known. I sat in that office for an hour, the folder trembling in my hands. Miriam brought me tea I didn't drink and closed the door to give me privacy. Finally, I asked the question that mattered. Why didn't he do anything? Miriam hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I think, she said gently, he was waiting for you to be old enough to understand and to protect you from the fallout. Your father loved you very much, Aubrey. That was never complicated. She pulled out another document, Edward's updated will, dated 2 months before his death. In it, he left the majority of the Wells estate and assets to me, not to Diana. The inheritance was substantial, millions of dollars, property, investments. He never told Diana, Miriam whispered. That frightened him more than anything. The unknown. I left the law office with copies of everything, my mind racing. That night, I drove to the county records office, which, thankfully, stayed open late. The clerk was a familiar face, Dr. Ian Mercer, my father's former physician. He'd retired from practice years ago and taken a part-time position handling medical records. I was wondering when you'd come, he said gently, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. You knew. I asked. Your father suspected about Liam years before he had proof. He asked me to keep a sealed file under your name, to be given to you when you came of age and asked the right questions. Ian handed me an envelope marked confidential. Wells Medical Records, Box 14. Inside were 2 documents, a copy of my father's DNA and another, a genetic profile labeled with only a name. Child A, birth year 1992. The results were unmistakable, not a biological match. Who is Liam's biological father? I asked quietly. Edward never told me a name, Ian said, but there were rumors. Someone from Diana's past, a man named Christopher Holbrook, a business associate who used to visit the house frequently. Your father called him Uncle Chris to you, but he didn't need to finish. I already understood. My mother had built her entire life on a lie. And somehow my father had known, had been quietly gathering evidence, had been planning a future where the truth would matter. I spent the next 3 weeks researching. Carefully, methodically, I learned that Christopher Holbrook was still alive, still in the area, still in business. I found old photographs from before I was born. My mother, visibly pregnant, standing beside a tall man with dark hair and a confident smile. The date on the back read, "Before a Little Miracle." I found financial records showing transfers from my father's company accounts to an account under the name V. Harlow, Valerie being my mother's maiden name. Hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled over 2 decades. I found a photograph of Liam next to Christopher Holbrook, taken at a charity gala 2 years ago. They had the same jaw, the same eyes. The pieces fit together like a puzzle designed by my dying father, but I needed more than evidence. I needed leverage. That's when I visited Mark at his office. My stepfather had aged in the past decade, his hair more silver now, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that money couldn't cure. He seemed genuinely surprised to see me. "Aubrey," he said, standing to embrace me. "It's been weeks. How are you? Diana mentioned you ran out of the Thanksgiving dinner rather dramatically." "I need to ask you something," I said, not returning the embrace. "And I need you to be honest with me." Something in my tone made him listen. I showed him the paternity report, the photographs, the financial records. Mark went very still. "Did you know?" I asked. He was silent for a long moment. Then, not at first. "I suspected about 5 years into my marriage to Diana. I had a private investigator look into it. When the results came back, I confronted her. She said it didn't matter, that Liam was my son in every way that mattered. And I was weak enough to believe her. Does Liam know?" "No. Diana has always been adamant that he never find out. She said it would destroy him. I met his eyes. Or destroy her." Mark looked away. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell the truth," I said simply. "About all of it." I knew Diana would never confess willingly, so I decided to give her a stage and let her destroy herself upon it. I asked her to brunch on a Saturday morning. Just the 2 of us. Her kitchen, as always, was pristine, marble counters gleaming. Everything in its place, everything controlled. "You're early," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek, that performance of motherhood that had always felt like a slap. "I'm so glad you came. I've missed you." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost believed it. "I found something," I said, placing the paternity report on her kitchen island. Diana's face went white. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, her perfect composure beginning to crack like ice under pressure. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Dad left it for me, along with other things. Letters, financial records, photographs." "You've been—" She stopped herself, but I could see the thought. "You've been snooping. You've been gathering evidence against me." "I've been understanding," I said calmly. "All these years, I thought something was wrong with me, that I wasn't good enough, wasn't special enough. But it wasn't about me at all, was it? It was about you, about protecting your lie." Diana sank into a chair. For the first time, I saw her without her armor. Not as a mother, not as a villain, but as a frightened woman watching her carefully constructed world crumble. "Your father was going to destroy this family," she said finally. "He threatened to expose everything, to take you away from me. I did what I had to do to keep us together." "You did what you had to do to keep yourself," I corrected. "And you sacrificed me to do it. Every day of my childhood. You made me feel like I didn't belong so you could feel safe in your lie." "I never—" "Yes, you did. You knew exactly what you were doing. And the worst part, Dad knew too. But he loved me enough to wait for me to be old enough to handle the truth." I picked up the paternity report. I'm going to a lawyer tomorrow. I'm going to share this with Liam, with Mark, with whoever needs to know. The life you've built on this lie is over, Mother. The only question now is how much damage it does on the way down. Diana's face crumpled. You'll destroy your own family. No, I said quietly. You already did that. I'm just cleaning up the debris. I left her sitting at that kitchen island, her perfect world shattered, her perfect face streaked with tears that came too late to change anything. The truth has a way of spreading like wildfire once it's been set loose. I met with Liam first. We sat in my apartment, and I showed him everything. The DNA reports, the photographs, the timeline that made it impossible to deny. He went through every stage of grief in one afternoon. Denial, anger, bargaining, despair, and finally a kind of numb acceptance. Does Mark know? He asked. He suspects. He has for years. And Dad knew the whole time? Yes, but he wanted to protect you. Liam was quiet for a long time. I think I knew too, he said finally. Not consciously, but there was always something. The way Diana was with me. The way Mark held back. I told myself I was imagining it, but I think part of me always knew I didn't quite belong. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Real, unguarded, and deeply sad. I'm sorry, he said, for everything, for the way she treated you, for not seeing it. You were a kid, I said. She manipulated all of us in different ways. What happens now? That depends on what we decide. We can press charges for fraud regarding the financial accounts. We can force a legal reckoning. Or he asked, or we can just let her live with the consequences of her choices. Let her watch her empire collapse. Let her feel, for once, what it's like to have no control. Liam nodded slowly. I vote for the second option. Within weeks, the news spread. Not scandals in the press. This wasn't a story for tabloids, but something quieter and more devastating. A family that had finally stopped lying to itself. Diana's friendships cooled. Invitations stopped arriving. Mark moved to the guest house, saying he needed space to process. Their marriage, I suspected, was over, had been over for years, held together only by the shared conspiracy of lies. Liam started therapy to work through the identity crisis that comes from discovering your entire history is a fiction. He changed his career path, left the company Diana had placed him in, and started working in nonprofit work, something that felt genuine to him for the first time. And I inherited my father's estate, not out of spite, but out of justice. Edward had planned this carefully, leaving Diana financially secure, but not wealthy, ensuring she couldn't simply buy her way back into propriety. 6 months after that brunch, I received a letter. It was forwarded from my lawyer, a handwritten envelope with my name in handwriting I almost didn't recognize. My mother's hand had never looked less sure. Aubrey, I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I want you to understand something, even if understanding doesn't change anything. I was 23 years old when I met Christopher Holbrook. I was young, ambitious, terrified of ending up like my mother, a woman whose entire identity was defined by a man. When Chris offered me something that felt like freedom, I took it. I became pregnant. And then Edward offered me something else, legitimacy, a way to have my child without losing my future. I told myself it was practical. I told myself I was protecting Liam. But the truth is I was protecting myself. And once the lie became my life, I couldn't stop living it. Every time I saw you, I was reminded of the cost of that choice. And instead of apologizing for it, I punished you for it. You were never the burden, Aubrey. I was. I don't ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know that your father was right about me. And perhaps, knowing that, you can finally be free. Diana. I read the letter once, then put it away. Forgiveness, I had learned, isn't something we grant to those who hurt us. It's something we grant to ourselves. 1 year later, I stood in my own apartment, preparing my first Thanksgiving dinner as the woman I had become. Not the woman my mother had tried to make me be, but the woman my father had always known I could be. Liam came, and Mark, and even Dr. Ian Mercer, who had been more of a father figure than Mark had ever managed to be. We didn't talk much about Diana. There was nothing left to say about her. Instead, we talked about my photography. A gallery show was being planned in the spring. Liam talked about a non-profit project he was passionate about. Mark talked about finally taking the time to travel, to live for himself for the first time in decades. As we sat around the table, I thought about my father, about the careful letters he'd left, the evidence he'd gathered, the inheritance he'd planned. He'd known he was dying, and instead of taking his secrets to the grave, he'd left them like breadcrumbs for me to follow. Be careful who you trust, he'd written. I had been careful, and that caution had saved me. What are you thinking about? Liam asked, watching my face. Dad, I said simply. I think he'd be proud of us. All of us. For finally being honest. I think so too, Liam said. And for the first time he said it without the edge of performance, just the simple truth. 2 years later, I sat across from Diana in a neutral office, a therapist space where we'd both agreed to meet. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more complicated than that. It was the recognition that two women, bound by blood and betrayal, had to find a way to live in the same world. I'm not asking you to forget, Diana said carefully. I'm asking you to let me try to be different. I'm not sure that's possible, I replied honestly. Neither am I, she admitted, but I'm trying. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say. Over the following year, Diana did change, not dramatically, not completely, but in small ways that suggested real effort. She started attending therapy. She moved out of the house and into a modest apartment downtown. She reached out to Christopher Holbrook, and Liam cautiously began to develop a relationship with his biological father, not to replace Edward, but to understand his own history. And I finally was free. The burden I had carried, the weight of my mother's disappointment, of never quite belonging, of constantly trying to earn love that was never meant to be earned, lifted. I understood something then that I hadn't before. The truth isn't always kind, but it is honest. And honesty, in the end, is kinder than any beautiful lie. My father had taught me that. He'd known that the only way to truly love someone is to let them see you clearly. Not the performance, not the armor, but the real, fragile, beautiful truth of who you are. On what would have been my father's 60th birthday, I stood at his grave with flowers, the same roses he'd always brought home for my mother, back when he'd still believed their marriage could be saved. Thank you, I whispered to the stone, for the letters, for the love, for knowing me better than I knew myself. The wind carried my words away, and I stood there in the quiet of the cemetery, finally at peace. I was no longer the burden. I was Aubrey Wells' daughter, sister, artist, and most importantly, survivor. And that was enough. My mother called me a burden. So I became silent, patient. I gathered evidence, followed my father's breadcrumbs, and discovered the truth. Respect is non-negotiable. Your worth isn't defined by anyone's seating chart, not by who gets credit, not by who's believed first. Silence became my weapon. Patience became my power. My story proves that the people who silence you are terrified of how strong you actually are. If this resonated with you, share it with someone gaslit into invisibility. Tell them, your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending instead of accepting theirs. Subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories about setting boundaries, finding your worth, and turning humiliation into triumph. Because your worth was never in question. It was only ever waiting to be remembered.